Presentation on corrective reading and decoding. I'm Robin Foster. I'm a teacher at an elementary school in Lexington, Kentucky, and I appreciate you being here this afternoon. So, to give you a little bit of background about the test and the students in this project, this project was done at a school where, according to the Department of Education, only 30.2% of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders tested scored at proficient or distinguished, and that's where we want them to be. So since almost 70% were not scoring at proficient and distinguished, we had to make some decisions about what we wanted to do to help get those kids caught up. And so one way that we test students in my building is we use something called the FAST test. The FAST test stands for Formative Assessment System for Teachers. It's a test that's given on the computer 3 times per year, and we use the results of that to help place children in groups for reading and math both. And so let's say that a kid does really well at the beginning of the year FAST test, and then they take it in January and they don't do so well. We may have to put them into some extra reading groups or extra math groups. We wait and see what the FAST test has to say about their performance. So as I was saying, the FAST test, depending on how a child performs, they're placed in one of 3 groups. Tier 1 means that they stay in the classroom and they receive instruction from just the classroom teacher. Tier 2 students mean that they didn't do so well on their FAST test, and so those kids may need some extra help in reading or extra help in math. And so sometimes that extra help may come in the classroom. Other times it may come from an additional teacher like an interventionist. Before a kid can be put in Tier 2 instruction, though, there is a team that meets and decides whether or not the child needs Tier 2 services. The very last group is what's called Tier 3 instruction, and these are for students who are already in Tier 1 and they're already in Tier 2, but they're not making progress. So these are kids that they're already getting a lot of instruction, but they're still having a hard time making the scores that we want them to do on in-class assessments as well as the FAST test. And just like Tier 2, before a child enters Tier 3, there's a group that meets and they look over and see whether or not a child definitely needs to be in Tier 3 instruction. Tier 3 is very focused and it's very small groups because these are kids who are really, really struggling with their lessons. Let's see here. One of the ways that we meet the Tier 2 and the Tier 3 instruction in my building is a reading program called Corrective Reading Decoding. And so it's what they call a scripted program because the teacher has a big manual and the teacher reads different portions of it and the students respond, and there's very strict guidelines about how to correct a kid if they misread a word or what to do if a child's not making progress. So corrective reading is one of the first programs used for intervention in my building, and so I wanted to take a good look at it and see the outcomes of students who received intervention and students who didn't receive intervention with the corrective reading program. And so now we'll go ahead and we'll talk a little bit about what the literature says about about corrective reading and about intervention. One of the things that Hempenstall found was that the education world just went on ahead and assumed that teachers knew how to develop and how to teach effective lessons. And then Hempenstall also found that there was a lot of leeway between different schools and different levels of accountability. For instance, some kids may be given corrective feedback on how to read a word correctly, other kids may not, and a lot of times programs were not implemented with fidelity, so they didn't have they didn't have that continuity they needed to make the program work. Corrective reading was a program that was developed to help the students with their word and text skills and a little bit of basic comprehension. Some of the good things about corrective reading is that it has good phonemic instruction, so the kids really understand the letters and the letter sounds. There are lots of practice opportunities, and there's very structured feedback systems. So corrective reading also really emphasizes that all students make progress before you go on to the next lesson. And according to Hempenstall, the corrective reading interventions produced higher test scores in elementary students in 4 out of the 5 studies that she reviewed. Corrective reading does meet the standards for what the federal government says is a scientifically proven reading program. And students were able to develop their phonics skills and to decode new words even if they had previously struggled. The What Works Clearinghouse is something that the government publishes so that schools and teachers can be aware of what they think about various reading programs. The What Works Clearinghouse reviewed 25 studies, and it found that there were potentially positive effects in the fluency and the alphabet lessons that that corrective reading taught, but they didn't see that it had any profound impact on comprehension. This study found that the students gained an average of 9 percentile points with the alphabet letters and names and decoding. And the federal government did say that corrective reading meets the criteria as an effective program. I also looked at a study by McDaniel, Hutchins, and Terry, and it studied the use of corrective reading in what's called emotionally and behavioral disorder students, or EBD. And it said that the EBD kids often struggle with reading because of various reasons, but one of them was teacher delivery, and that this study did find that the emotional and behavioral disorder students did experience positive reading gains with the corrective reading instructions. So this was found something that was beneficial for regular elementary classrooms, but especially beneficial with students who struggled with behavior problems. So my research question was, what outcome does corrective reading have on 4th grade students' FAST test scores? And as I stated earlier, there were almost 70% of students who didn't score proficient on the state test. And the corrective reading program in my building is used for both Tier 2 and Tier 3 students, especially those kids who are not making progress, and we want to make sure that they understand how to read unknown words. And I really wanted to determine if there was an effect of the corrective reading program on 4th grade FAST scores. So let me tell you a little bit about who all was in the study. There were 20 4th grade students in an urban Lexington, Kentucky elementary school. Every single one of the kids qualified for free and reduced lunch. And the way that these students were selected, there were 10 students who received corrective reading as an intervention because they did not make the FAST level scores. And then there were 10 students who did not receive reading intervention because they scored too high to receive the Tier 2 intervention services, excuse me. And so what I did was I took their test scores from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, and I examined those. And to be considered proficient, a 4th grade student had to earn a 499 on the reading assessment in the fall and a 511 on the reading assessment in the spring. So all 20 of the students took the FAST test 3 times a year. There were also weekly assessments for kids in Tier 3 instruction, and that required them to read a passage and to read part of it out loud, and then to finish it and answer comprehension questions. After the FAST tests were scored in the fall, fourth grade students went into their reading instruction based on their FAST score. If they were in the 20th percentile or below, they entered Tier 2 instruction. The Tier 2 instruction program, all the students received corrective reading decoding 4 times per week, and each lesson was 45 minutes long. And then on the 5th day, they did their weekly assessments, and they answered questions about that. Some of the limitations for this study were the school where the study took place. There's a lot of kids who move in and out, and so the researcher was a little bit worried about keeping the same 20 students the entire year, and also 20 kids is a small sample size. So now we'll go ahead and take a look at the data. Before I show you the charts, the following questions were asked. What was the average gain for each group? What was the average gain for the corrective reading kids versus the non-corrective reading kids? Did every participant make gains? And did every participant reach the benchmark score by the end of the year? Reminder, the benchmark score by the end of the year was 511. And so here you have a chart that shows you the students who received corrective reading. And so I went on ahead and I changed all the names to preserve anonymity, and you can see that these kids, their minimal score we were hoping for at the beginning of the year was 499, and the lowest kid scored 418, and the highest kid in this group scored 479. So they were still about 20 points below where we wanted them to be. And then if you look here in the spring, you can see that we had one student who got a little bit close to that 511 score, but by and large, they were still behind at the end of the year according to the FAST reading assessment. And over here I have the change, and we'll go into those numbers a little bit more in a minute. But a lot of the students who received corrective reading did indeed make progress. So now here are the students who did not receive corrective reading, and you can see that there's a huge difference, because before, with the last chart, there was the lowest student had scored 418, and in this one the lowest student had scored 492. So they didn't receive intervention services because while they didn't make the cutoff score, they also didn't make the 20th percentile or below. And in this one, there were quite a few students who did make the spring benchmark goal of 511. And in this sample, all 10 students made gains. And here is a chart that shows the FAST growth from the fall to the spring. The blue bars are the bars of kids who did receive corrective reading, and the orange bars are kids who did not receive corrective reading. And so you can look at it and you can see we have this one kind of outlier here with the blue bars, but by and large, the students who received corrective reading, they made larger gains than the kids who didn't receive corrective reading. And so to just go ahead and break down that information a little bit more, you can see that the corrective reading students, 90% or 9 out of 10 of them made progress on their FAST score. And the range of scores, so one student dropped 18 points, and we'll get into that in a minute, but another student went up 33 points. And so when I took all those scores, I took those 10 scores and I averaged them together, the average FAST score point gain for the corrective reading students was 13 points. And when you look at the no corrective reading kids, 100% of them made progress on their FAST test. The range of scores for that one, one child went up 7 points, another child went up 26 points. So there was a lot of growth in that, but and the average FAST score point gain for the non-corrective reading students was 14.6 points. So yet again, the corrective reading kids, they made larger goals. So the students, when you take the average of the students who received corrective reading and the students who didn't receive corrective reading, the students who didn't receive corrective reading scored slightly higher, like literally 1.6 points, than the kids who received corrective reading. And as you know, it was a small sample size, so that one child losing 18 points on their FAST test score, that really skewed the data for that particular group. The students who received corrective reading typically made higher gains than the non-corrective reading. So 4 out of 10 corrective reading kids made gains of 20 points or more. And so that's huge. I mean, that's almost 2 years. And then the non-corrective students, there were only 2 kids who made gains of 20 points or more. None of the corrective reading students made the FAST spring benchmark goal of 511. Only 4 of the non-corrective reading students made the spring benchmark goal. We're going to let that go because that's the Senior Health Center. Okay, so to continue with the data summary, the blue bars were higher because those students had more growth to make. For instance, you know, if you're 300 pounds and you want to lose weight, and you lose 100 pounds versus somebody who's 150 pounds and gets to 125, the blue bars, they had a higher ceiling of growth that they could make. The orange bars were lower because the students were near grade level, and so they really didn't have that much growth to make. Just some more notes about the kid who dropped 18 points. They had some health issues, they had some attendance issues, and so I think that accounted for part of the drop, and so that child is actually now in special education classes. To make 1 year's growth on the FAST test, the kids had to increase their score by 12 points from the beginning of the year to the end. And so 50% of both groups, both the corrective and non-corrective reading, 50% made more than 1 year's growth according to the FAST test. And 2 non-corrective reading students made 2 years growth, and 4 corrective reading students made 2 years growth. So that's, I mean, 2 years growth in 1 year, that's huge. And so now we're nearing the end of it. I need to tell you a little bit about a PLC survey that I administered. And so my focus question after giving this survey to the teachers was, what strengths does the first grade team have based on the trust survey results? And what areas of growth does the first grade team have based on trust survey results? So for this particular survey, there were 3 veteran teachers, 1 teacher who was in her 22nd year, another teacher who was in her 18th year, and 1 teacher who was in her 10th year of teaching. So I chose to administer the Trust on Our Team survey because every team in our building has new members. Many people have switched grades, and a lot of people are a little bit cautious about new grades and new teams. And I personally feel like if you have good trust and good rapport with your teammates, then that's going to carry over into areas of instruction and student achievement. This survey was administered anonymously so that the respondents' thoughts and feelings would be honored, and all 3 members completed the survey. And here's a picture of the survey I used. It was 1 page, and Hello and welcome to the conclusion. So, as you can see, this is the survey that I gave to the teachers. It's just 1 page. All they had to do was circle their answer. So this survey was placed in the teachers' mailboxes. The survey was completed outside of their normal professional learning committee time, and it was put in my mailbox once they were finished with it. The survey would give a statement such as, I look forward to spending time with my teammates. I believe I can learn from my teammates. I feel welcome in my teammates' room. I enjoy the time I spend with my teammates. And so it would give some examples, and then it would ask the respondent to agree, disagree, or they could be neutral on the statement. It also asked them to rate how important that was to the person answering. So they would have a statement, they would answer agree, disagree, or neutral, and then they would say that one, that statement was very important to them, two, the statement was somewhat important, or three, it was not important at all. The survey had 16 statements, and it allowed the respondents to write suggestions on how to increase the trust in their PLC on the back. Overall, the results were mostly positive. Two of the three teachers who answered marked agree or neutral to most of the statements. One person said that they disagreed with feeling welcome in her teammates' classrooms. She disagreed that her teammates were honest, and she disagreed that she could learn from her teammates. So obviously there are some things there that need to be addressed. The respondents all marked that the statements were very important, except for some of them marked that it was only somewhat important that they looked forward to spending time with their colleagues. So I had to make some recommendations for the next steps for this team. And so I looked at the answers, and I also looked at the back. There were three surveys given, and only one person made suggestions on what would help the PLC time. And that person wrote, it starts with leadership. Once they establish trust and confidence, the staff and the teams will too. And I think that the teams need time to build their relationships. I also think that they need to be in charge of the agenda for their PLC and not the district. And so once the teachers are given more ownership of that time, they will respond to it better. And so my final thoughts on the PLCs for this particular team are, whenever we teach a kid to do something new, whenever we're teaching them addition or subtraction or multiplication or even how to write their name, we don't try to do too much at once. We break it down into smaller, more manageable steps, and we teach the kids that one step. And then we let them have lots of opportunities to practice that one step. And I think that same process would be beneficial to the PLCs. I think that the teams need to break it into manageable steps and just focus on one thing, and really become fluent in that one area before they try to do something else. I think we also need to be reminded that Rome wasn't built in a day, and so it is going to take time. It is going to take time and lots of practice before the PLCs have the familial tone that we want them to have. So I'm really grateful, because especially after this class, I feel much better about being in a professional learning committee, and I even feel comfortable in leading one. So any questions?